So, this is something different. This is appropriately on April Fool's Day. This is going to be coming out, and it's my take on what I would do for SDSR 2025. Now, I will say I'm going to indulge myself, and hopefully you'll give me this grant me this indulgence, in that I am going to be light on figures. Again, we're already talking about increasing defence spending, and what I'm going to propose in this is not going to be a dramatic, massive increase. In fact, much of it is probably going to be a bit boring, because, as people know, the guy who believes that infrastructure comes first, that you invest in people, in their accommodations and infrastructure first, and then you build out the systems from it. I am not one of those people who's going to sit here and go, you know what we need to do immediately is cancel these programs and invest in this bright new idea which might pay off in 5 years' time. Because one of the things of being a historian is that you learn very quickly. Three things are true in defence and in pretty much all procurement. One, the next great thing is always just around the corner. Two, the system that is the wonder weapon that has amazingly rocked the world has usually been around for about at least 3-4 decades in various stages of development already, and maybe even use before it's become a wonder weapon. And three, and this is always the most important, that if in doubt, the quickest way to not get anything in defence is to cancel existing programs and pump money into into programs which are going to be future systems, and they don't deliver, because then that just starts a cycle of cancelling and repeating and cancelling and repeating. If you want a good example of that, look at the British Army, who started off with the Boxer program originally, then cancelled that and moved through multiple programs which they keep cancelling, and then eventually returned to the Boxer program in a far less advantageous position to secure it. Now, there are legitimate reasons the whole way through for those changes, but it was always the pursuit of the perfection, the pursuit of the best option, not the good enough option, not the we can adapt this will be a 90% solution, it won't be perfect, but we can adapt it and make it jolly good, and frankly, we can do that and get in service right now, rather than maybe waiting and trying to keep old equipment going for so long. We often joke about the B-52 being around in Star Wars. Well, the FV-432 has been in service since 1963. It's an APC of the FV-430 family, and they have been extended well into the 2020s. The updated version, by the way, is called the Bulldog. One of the things you find that happens with the British Army is occasionally they keep something going by updating it, giving it a name change, and then hope no one realises that you still got something going on a frontline combat vehicle, which your infantry ride into battle in, that is heading for 60 plus years old in service. And to be honest, its development started a decade earlier than that. The last vessels were, the last vehicles in that line, I think, were built in 1971. So there are no hulls. None which are less than 50 years old. No matter how many times they've been rebuilt. Now, this is an SDSR 2025. It is therefore, by its nature, a British-centric scenario, because it's a British Defence Review I'm looking at. So all those who, and I'm sure there'll be at least a couple who will comment, why haven't you covered the French, or why haven't you covered the Americans, or why haven't you covered X, Y, or Z? Because I'm not doing their SDSR. If you'd like me to do defence reviews in 2025 of what I'd be doing if I was in charge of their Procurement and their review of their strategic issues, I will do those for you if you wish. You can set them as Patreon questions if you want, and I will happily talk them through. But this came up as a topic to discuss during several videos recently, and so I thought, well, for April Fool's Day. I don't tend to do a jokey video for April Fool's Day, but I do tend to do something special. So, I moved Somerville to tomorrow. Sorry, Admiral Somerville. And I've done this. Now let's start off with pay. It's prosaic. It's a strange place to start, perhaps, but I know the starting salary for every single branch of the armed forces there, if you look, is 17 grand a year initial base pay. Now, yes, those of that rank can earn up to 26 grand a year, or depending on service. In the Royal Navy, they can earn up to nearly 29 grand a year. Army, it's 26. Air Force, it's nearly 29 again. Royal Marines, it's 26. That's for able seaman or private. My view is this. The base pay for the armed forces needs to be increased. It really does. It'll be, if I was doing extra funding, pretty much one of the first things I do is fix the base pay. Increase it. There are 3 reasons for this. One, whilst patriotism will get a lot of people through the door, patriotism doesn't pay bills. Patriotism doesn't allow you to buy presents for your family. Patriotism doesn't cover the hours, and you are going to be doing a lot of work. Yes, you get a lot of opportunities in the armed forces. Yes, there are a lot of chances to increase your pay by doing specialisms and all these things, which can allow you to grow your pay greatly, depending on your area of specialty. But still, if we are going to solve recruitment and retention as an issue, then I think it's sensible to start with the very first thing, pay. Now, I get into this discussion a lot when I'm talking about academics, when I'm talking about all sorts of things, because you are never going to pay these people what they are worth to society. You are never. Because it's just not viable. It would cost so much, it would increase the tax bill so much, it would bankrupt the country. Same with teachers, same with doctors in the NHS, nurses in the NHS, every policeman, fireman, all of them. Okay? But you have to pay them a viable wage. And I'm sorry. But you can go, well, they're only 18 years old, they only had a few months training, it's a decent wage. Yeah, but it's the wage they could be getting paid when they're getting shot at in your name. And yes, they sign up for that. But how comfortable are you with feeling that they're earning that all? How comfortable? And the thing is, to me, is if you can increase the base pay, that's the minimum payment they earn, that it's earned at every rank, especially for the lower ranks. And honestly, once you're getting onto Chief of Defence staff and you're earning 230,000+ a year, I think you're fine. But it's the ones on 17 grand a year I worry about. Honestly, I would like to see that up to, well, if you want to really fix retention and make sure you're retaining those personnel, then you have probably got to start upping the pay to the point at which the basic pay probably has to come in at about 21 to 24 grand a year, somewhere in the region of there, as is minimum. And yeah, that's a hefty increase. Your other option, of course, is to make it so that members of the armed forces don't pay any taxes. They don't pay any income tax. They don't pay any national insurance. Could make it so that they don't have to pay any tax on their earnings, which might actually be a cheaper way to get around it. Because then you go, well, yeah, you're only earning this much, but you're earning all of it. Is it cheaper for the government to work out? I'm not sure. But if you want to build an effective armed forces, if you want to build an effective defense and security apparatus that is going to protect your nation and its interests, its people, wherever they need to be protected in the world, but especially at home, you've got to start with pay. You have to start with pay. And that leads me into the next thing. Armed Forces Accommodation. It's become a joke. It's a meme. The quality of Armed Forces Accommodation. Honestly, the quality of social housing in this country is sometimes fairly ribald and interesting, depending on which council, which trust you're dealing with. But Armed Forces Accommodation is slightly more problematic. You see, the Armed Forces has the unique benefit of having a lot of heritage estate to manage. And this is a great thing because, honestly, for personnel, they need the history helps them. The history binds them. The history gives them examples to draw from when they're at their hardest, toughest moments. But, and this is the problem I have with it, as much as I like preserving historic buildings, and I believe we should do because of the history and heritage, I think honestly there should be some sort of ruling for armed forces, for the armed forces when they're using them, that internally, as long as they're not completely changing their function, they can make suitable adjustments within the building where it does not destroy the fabric of the building to meaningfully destroy the fabric of the building, I should use that phrase, to adjust to suit their needs, to provide the level of accommodation which you need. And it's one of the interesting things for me in accommodation is that we know it's been a problem for roughly 50 years. I have picked just one of many reports which have been done into it. There seems to be almost every government produced a report. I think even the Truss government actually managed a report on armed forces accommodation and what needed to be improved. I'm not 100% sure. They did manage some defence reports. It's been something which is heavy on reforms and bright ideas, but ultimately, if you're going to fix it, you have to make sure someone's responsible for it, and that responsibility carries weight. i.e., if you're not going to sack the minister in charge of armed forces accommodation because the accommodation is terrible, then you need to have someone that they can sack who reports to them. That's it. If you're not going to sack the politician, you need to have someone they can sack when it's not working. Someone whose job is on the line because it isn't good enough. Someone who has long-term responsibility and real power to affect things. The contracts, if they are public-private finance, have to be renegotiated in a way that actually means that there's support. Actually means it works out. Now, some of the accommodation is good. I have heard some good reports about some accommodation, but more often than not, I hear issues with getting electricians and plumbers to fix things, getting the accommodation right, turning up and finding a house which has actually not been used for 5 years and is derelict. All sorts of problems. And yes, the stories, bad stories will spread further than good stories. I know this. But there shouldn't be any of those stories going around. There just shouldn't be. And again, retention. You see, the thing is, if you got good pay and you've got good accommodation for you and your family, especially when you've been in the service longer, so you actually have a family, you're more likely to stay. And there's this very scary thing you have to remember with retention. Whilst, yes, we want young, fit, healthy warfighters. That's the phrase which I get drummed in my face so many times a day. It's very American sounding to me. Very, very American. But I can understand where it comes from. But the thing is, you also need the sergeants, the more senior NCOs, the warrant officers. You need the captains, the majors, the colonels, the generals. You need the specialists, the engineers, and the medics. You need the people who are going to be in for a few years and have been in there for a while to harness that youthful energy. For it to work, you need the experience as well. And it's always the problem when we talk about it, because sometimes, and it used to be until recently, the focus was always on recruitment. What are the recruitment figures? But now we have recently started also asking how many people are leaving the armed forces, because one of the problems you have is when you're not recruiting enough to cover how many people are leaving, so you definitely can't grow. Some of the reductions in headcount over recent years have actually been caused by people leaving faster than they've been joining. And again, pay and accommodation are big factors in this. Yes, there's also the fact that some people just want to get a better job in civilian life because they can get one, it's more stable for their family. And that comes again into the accommodation thing. Into the accommodation scenario, schooling. And setting up good links for schools. So that so that you can feel your children are still getting a good education, that they're not suffering because of your career. Because the thing is, for armed forces to work, we are looking for people who are loyal, who believe in their country, who are willing to put it all on the line for that country. And those are great things. But the trouble is, a loyal person will tend to not only be loyal to their country, they'll also be loyal to their family. And you don't want to be in a situation where you force them to pick between their family's success, their family's quality of life, and they're serving the country. Because you might lose that. In fact, you could very well lose that debate. Because when it's coming up to the end of their contract, where they could either re-up and sign another contract for another few years, maybe go for a promotion, all those things. Well, if they're looking at you going, okay, so what happens to my kid's schooling? Oh, well, you could get moved and you might get a place in a decent school, but it might also be a terrible school. And that's a whole other thing with the education system which needs to be fixed. Or we might give you, disadvantage or that disadvantage, but it doesn't matter. You'll still join us. That's when you have the problems. That's when you have the problems. So I would argue in my own way again that if I was the minister in charge of accommodation, if I was looking after accommodation for the armed forces, I'd also be looking at the school catchment areas where my accommodation is, and I'd be looking at the schools in the area. And I'd honestly be interested in, how are you? Do we have to give you some money to make sure that the good schools always have some spare capacity available for if we have to suddenly transfer people in and their kids need to move schools? That's fine, don't worry. There'll be a place at this school. Can you guarantee it? I guarantee it. Because we've paid the money. And if the school isn't able to provide a place, well, then we'll get the money back off them. Which is going to cause an issue, but, you know. This was also one of the reasons why, actually, originally there were not just private boarding schools in the UK, there were also state boarding schools in the UK. There still are a couple, believe it or not. Because they were set up to support members of the armed forces' children when they had to be stationed abroad. So they could still send their kids to a state school. Now, the thing is, they'd only have to pay for the accommodation. They don't have to find funding for the accommodation. Usually the armed forces would help them with that. The thing is, those have been shut down more and more and more by local education authorities because they don't serve the local need. They serve the national need, but they don't serve what the local education authority is trying to manage. I think I'm not quite sure how many are left. I think it might be 3. But I could be wrong, because the schools have survived. Most of the schools have survived. They've just dropped the ability to have boarders. They no longer have boarding facilities. There's actually one of them I've gone and done some work at over the years in a summer school scenario. And they're a lovely school. They've got lovely facilities. And you know very much that the kids staying in the boarding houses, you know why they're staying there. But those schools are very, very rare. And again, this is about bringing a whole nation approach to defense and security. You've got to think about these people. You've got to think about their lives, because if you want to retain them, if you want them to stay in service, you need to make those decisions as easy as possible for them. Because you are not going to pay them a multi-million-pound salary. Literally, most of these skilled, capable people can go out and earn more money doing bodyguarding duties or civilian engineering jobs or civilian airline pilots or those things. So the thing is, you have to make it so that, yeah, the money's good, but then, of course, my kid would also have to leave the good school she's in, that one, and the house is fairly decent. I have to sort out the house, and I'd have to... You want to make sure you are giving incentives. In America, they have the option, of course, that they have privatized healthcare. So they have all sorts of veterans and VA medical assistance, which is a really nice thing to have. But it is literally one of the reasons why some of their forces stay in, because of the medical care. You don't have that option in the UK. You have the NHS. It's useful. It's there to take care of. One of the reasons it was set up when it was to look after the World War I and World War II generations. To make sure that they had, not only was it a land fit for heroes, that the heroes would be alive to enjoy that land. And it worked mostly. But the thing is, that's very separate. That's very separate from that's very separate from the armed forces care. And again, it's something we have to think about. Accommodation, education, their families, the way we're setting up and supporting these systems, all have to be in. And yes, there is a systems provider. Yes, there is. They do try their best for joined up thinking. I just think more needs to be done. It needs to be made easier, but also more incentivized for all the other various other moving parts to be actively participating. Now, why does this matter? I've been saying it all matters, but why does it matter? And again, I want to point towards the fact that these armed forces reviews, these pay things, I'm not talking out of nowhere here. It's an ongoing issue. But governments want to keep trying to look for a gimmick solution than the actual solution because it would cost them more money because they didn't want to raise the defense budget. Well, now they're having to raise the defense budget. We've all heard talks it's going up to 2.5%, it'll go to 3% by so-and-so and all this. It's going up. Not by a massive amount, but it's going up. Well, first thing to sort out is pay and accommodation. That is the first thing we need to do. Why? Because we want to sort out retention. Because we need to keep skills and capabilities in there. Because another issue you have is if, and that's been shown in lots of recent wars, if you find yourself in a situation where you need to rapidly expand your armed forces, rapidly expand their capabilities, you need the veteran core of it. You need the well-drilled, well-trained part of it to be quite capable, because they're going to suddenly have to take a whole lot of new recruits and turn them into something. And that requires more than a 12-slide PowerPoint delivered but remotely over a workstation. It does require more. It's not a quick point through multiple choice quiz. Watch some videos. It's going to be a lot of training, and it requires a lot of instructors who need to know their tasks thoroughly, because you can't explain anything to anyone if you don't understand it well yourself. You really can't. And this chart is exactly that, by the way. The one at the top of this one, it's intake and outflow. 12 months. It's of a period, it's from 2018 to 2023. 12-month periods intersected, and telling you what the intake and outflow is. And by the end, by 2024, the outflow was, the end of December 2023. The outflow was 16,000, the inflow was 10,000. The intake. And that's a problem. When that dotted line gets higher, ideally, you want them to stay roughly parallel. Ideally, you'd like them to be pretty much dead on the same if you want to maintain your forces. If you want to grow your forces, then the solid line had better be bigger than the dashed line. And the trouble is who you're losing. It's very rare you're losing the 18 to 19-year-olds in this batch. But the 20 to 24-year-olds, 25 to 29-year-olds, and then there's a big dip down to the 30 to 34-year-olds. In fact, the big starting point, we start to lose the experienced personnel we want to retain, the ones we'd like to become more senior ranks, is about 30. Which is also curiously about the average age when people usually are getting married, starting to have children. Notice the accommodation thing, the education thing, the pay thing, trying to support a family, trying to get their kids into good schools, trying to have decent housing. It all builds up. It all does build up. And that leads us to the next thing. Defense infrastructure. Now here we have a really big problem in the UK, because there is a whole gamut of issues for me to run through, but basically, end of history. The fact that wars were only going to be fought, any wars we fought in the future were going to be wars of choice. I would love to say the events of September the 11th, 2001, would have erased that idea, but it didn't. The defense estate has been shrinking for decades now. Now, this was based on certain ideas. One of those included that we would never fight another peer-on-peer conflict. We would never find ourselves in a scenario where we might be so threatened. And that's great if that was the case, but if it isn't the case, then you've lost some of your redundancy, because some of the basing you maintain, some of the facilities you maintain, literally are to allow for easy expansion, and that's why you maintain them, to allow for redundancy in case of things are destroyed, to allow you to spread things out around the country, which makes degrading your capabilities to a point at which they are not functional more difficult. And to be honest, this goes much deeper than just a defence estate. You can see that with national infrastructure, you can see that with things like power supplies and all these things. There has been a great predilection of thought of, it's okay, it's safe, we can afford to take these risks. We can always afford to take these risks because our bluff is never going to be called. Well, if your bluff is called, you're in trouble. You're in a lot of trouble. And that's what we're at the situation of. UK, I would argue, the whole of Europe is in a situation where their bluffers are being called. No, they're not fighting a hot war directly themselves. They're not. But those years and years of the world's going to be peaceful, so we can afford to do this. We can afford to cut our spending, cut our capabilities. I will hope those years are over and they will start thinking rationally about what they need. Even in 2016, and I can go for even more recent papers than that, the papers, the pages about defense infrastructure were full of bits they were selling off. Pages and pages of sites they were selling off and getting rid of. The phrases were consolidation, efficiency, cost effectiveness. Words like resilience, security didn't come up. And it's really interested me because in 2016 was when we started realistically getting into withdrawing some of the armed forces from Germany and really pulling them back from the European, again because we didn't need any forces there anymore. And various other things we started doing in that period, various other things we started cutting. And if you're drawing forces and you're bringing back more equipment, you think you'd be having to retain these facilities while you did that, but no. They could also sell off at the same time. Now, I am someone who believes that fundamentally infrastructure is the base point. After you've got your people sorted out, infrastructure is the base point of everything. If you haven't got the ammunition, if you haven't got the fuel, if you haven't got the capacity to build the ammunition at a sufficient rate, if you haven't got the capacity to maintain the ammunition, maintain the vehicle fleet, maintain the ships, maintain the aircraft, support them and sustain them in flight, you haven't really got anything. This is a point I often get into trouble with, because when talking about nations and their effectiveness of their armed forces, I will tend to ask things like, so how many transporters, vehicle transporters do they have that can take their tanks on rapid road maneuvers? Do they have any? Do they have enough for their tank fleet? How are their roads at manoeuvring their tank fleet? I.e., do they have roads which can actually sustain the 70-ton vehicle going across? Or do they not? Do they have roads which can allow those tank transporters to rapidly transit their armoured vehicles from where they need to be, where they are to where they need to be? These things matter. The UK is hopefully in a fortunate position that we don't realistically have to look at a physical invasion threat currently. And one of the things I would like people to understand is when you're doing an SDSR, you're not thinking about the next 50 years. Theoretically. I would say you should be thinking in terms of 50, 100 years. But in terms of your initial equipment, your initial force structure, what you're looking at the next 5 to 10 years. You can't see any further ahead than that. You really can't. This is something which I tried to talk about when talking about discussing technology earlier. What is the next big thing in terms of defense weaponry? We will all hazard our guesses at. We all have our guesses which we're sure about, but I will tell you that a goodly portion of time, many people are wrong with those guesses. Many, many people are wrong. If you want to go back in history, there was the fact that their plans in just prior to World War II. One of the great ideas that was going around was the idea of using rockets to lay minefields in the air. Now, minefields are a very dangerous thing, but making a minefield sit in the air, that's pretty darn interesting idea. Can you do that? Turns out you can't. Now, today with drones, little small drones, you possibly could do. So the technology might be coming about, but the thing is, the ideas might be there. We might even have technology we can make the ideas look viable. But are they realistically viable? That will be found out by the crucible of exercise and conflict. And again, the interesting thing is 55,000 home housing target this parliament. That's from 2016. Housing comes up a lot. 91 of our most expensive sites being disposed of by 2040. Okay, so you're disposing of your most expensive sites. That's good. What does that mean? Does that mean you no longer have a base in central London for any troops in central London? Oh, that could turn out to be a problematic if you're dealing with little green men causing trouble. I'm not talking about aliens. There are all sorts of issues that come in once you start looking at these things and you go, okay, it makes sense from perspective if you're only ever worried, it's wars of choice and you're thinking the armed forces are something you just have because governments have them, not because you actually need them and because you like to be able to do things with them, and they're not really going to matter. If you didn't have them, it wouldn't cause you any issues. No, the reality is they do. The reality is they do, and that's being drummed home. And impotency is a hard pill for politicians, for any government to swallow, let alone politicians as a whole to swallow, because it makes them look bad. And politics is about imagery and control of imagery. It always has been. That's how you get elected. That's how you stay in power. The image of you as a leader, the image of you as an effective person, as a local everyman, but who's also able to stand up on the national stage and represent those local everymen in a way the nation will understand. Yes, imagery matters. And that's cynical of me to say, but again, I'm a historian. We're a cynical breed. We truly are. Often, the scariest thing when you're having these discussions and you're involved in the defense-related tool is trying to make people look beyond the imagery. Because they might have the imagery of Britain is weak and deserves to be. Or Britain is weak and can't change it. Or Britain is strong and you can't say anything different. It's traitorous to suggest anything else. And the reality, of course, is none of those positions are correct. Not a single one. Britain is neither weak nor overwhelmingly strong. Britain is not in a situation which it cannot correct, but it cannot correct it overnight. It just can't. And arguing because you can't solve a problem in 24 hours, you should not solve the problem, is not a good logical position to be in. In fact, it's frankly disturbing. when people use that one. We can't solve this problem quickly enough, so we shouldn't solve it. We should avoid it, or give in, or surrender. That just doesn't work for me. And it shouldn't work for anyone else. It really shouldn't. Now this brings me to industry. Now I mentioned that already with terms of production, but in an ideal world, in an ideal economic model, especially in modern capitalism and our take on modern national economics, a nation would be able to order enough equipment to sustain multiple domestic suppliers for every single piece of equipment. And the competition between these suppliers should provide for an ideal cost-benefit scenario, as well as for constant technological growth, as they compete with each other for the orders. If you want to see an example of that, 1920s, 1910s, 1900s UK, that's pretty much what Britain enjoyed. For nations who don't have that situation, though, your scenario becomes a conundrum of subsidy of domestics for suppliers, foreign outsourcing, nationalisation, or nothing. You either have to buy it from abroad, buy it domestically, but make sure that company has incentives to keep going, or buy it domestically and basically nationalise that company so that you're still paying for the cost of everything. But yeah, you might be their only customer. You no longer have to put their profit margin at the expense of the taxpayer. That was actually one of the reasons why the Royal Navy for many years ran Royal Dockyards. Quite simply, it wasn't just because the Royal Navy liked having control of the entire process from the beginning to the end of the production ships in the age of sail to ensure their quality. It was also because, ultimately, it allowed them to drive technological investment by investing in their own yards. It allowed them to drive quality. It allowed them to assess what was being built. And most importantly, it meant in lean times, when they needed to buy ships but they didn't have the budget to buy ships and give someone a healthy, fat profit margin, they didn't have to. Now this is where I get into fun normally, because, well, and I will hold my hand up here, I normally fit into, I would say, the right of centre in UK politics. That's roughly where I fall as a rule. We all have our own predilections. We all have our own views. That's where I tend to fall in the UK. But I am, and always have been, far more of a pragmatist and a realist than an ideological. And I often put forward when it comes to defence, it doesn't matter which company I'm in, whether I'm in friends who are from left of centre or right of centre or whatever their political spectrum, I will put forward that there are certain parts of the UK defence industry which, frankly, I don't understand why they are still private companies, because the British government is literally their only client. They only build and sell stuff to the British government. That means they have no competition, no spreading of costs around multiple clients. Literally, everything is paid for by the British government. They are their sole customer. In a Japanese setting, and if they were an independent factory as part of a factory group, they'd be described as being part of that group, part of that factory, that company's grouping. That factory literally exists to service this group. It might be technically not owned by the group, but that's all it exists for. And very much it is that group. It's the same with these companies. Barrow Furnace is a good example. If the Royal Navy tomorrow decided it was getting no more nuclear-powered submarines, it'd be gone. It would be gone. There are no other markets it is selling to. So the thing is, whilst I can imagine a reason for why you would maybe make it commercial run, I can see options for that. I'm not really sure at a certain point why, when you have such a situation which is of such national importance, you are still running it and pretending it's a normal functioning private company. It isn't. It might be a section of BAE Systems, and they might supply a whole gamut of different things and be quite a large defence company, and a really good one in some regards. But still, there are sections of them which literally exist to just supply the British government, and they sell those things to no one else. Now, I am probably never going to win the argument of re-establishing Royal Dockyards, because the modern world we live in believes that these things are anachronistic, for the most part. But to me, if I was looking at getting best value for money out of these systems, I'd often be asking myself, if I am literally the only buyer, the only market for this company, I am their profit margin. I am everything for them. Yes, it means that when they take on debt to improve the facilities, it's not me as the government taking on debt, it's the private company, which is advantageous. But who are they going to charge or pass on the cost of that debt to? Me, their only customer, and i.e. the British taxpayer. So it's still my debt. It's just one step and a profit margin removed. And the contracts with me are what are used to guarantee that debt. And so if I cancel those contracts, then I could still end up on the hook for it if they go bankrupt. Or at least people trying to sue me for it. Single source suppliers. And yes, you can say, well, they have components from this company and all these things, and that's true. There is some market options below this level. But there aren't many. There aren't many. And one of the reasons for that, though, is the number of submarines we're building. It didn't used to be this way. If you go look back in time at British yards and building nuclear submarines, you'll find there used to be multiple yards involved. In the time when this building was Vickers Barrow Furnace, the other yard which was building nuclear submarines was Camel Laird's. Camel Laird's also built nuclear submarines. Admittedly, the vast majority have been built by Vickers, but things like HMS Conqueror, that was built by Camel Laird's. They built the hull. Vickers built the machinery, but Camel Laird's built the hull. But that cost a lot more money than her sisters did because it was split up. And that's one of the reasons why we went with a single source supplier. We thought we could functionally integrate them. But the thing is, you're still paying the profit margin for that single source supplier. Anyway, with that being said, let's move to our midpoint, which is the Shameless book plug. So why am I doing a Shameless book plug in this video? Well, honestly, because I'm a naval historian, and this is my book, and no one else is going to plug it but me. So I shamelessly plug my book. Thank you everyone for liking, sharing, subscribing, supporting the channels. If you do, it always helps the channel grow. It always helps me reach more people, which is a really nice thing. And I am a naval historian doing this. This is the point. But today might seem a bit naval orientated. Well, it's unlikely to give naval examples because those are the ones I'm most familiar with. But I study a lot of defense because I have to. Because my PhD was war studies. The naval aspect of war studies, but I did war studies. Which meant at King's College London, which meant I did a lot of covering more than just naval warfare. Because you have to. It all integrates together in many, many ways. And many, sometimes weird and beautiful ways, sometimes silly and disturbing ways, but we'll leave that to one side. The thing is, it's not my only book, because others are going to be coming soon. I'm trying Kindle Direct Publishing because I want to see if that's a better model for historians going forward. I'm trying to push these things to see what is going to be the best way to fund naval history going forward, to fund the study of naval history, to fund the research and all the things I do. And currently, the best thing I found is YouTube, and your support, your kindness, the super chats, the super thanks, the memberships, the patrons. Those are the things I found. The various people who do Ko-fi, and some people do direct PayPal donations. I still find that a little bit funny, but people prefer to do that sometimes, and I am just too thankful to really argue in any way that I don't think it. You see, the thing is with Patreon, there's at least merchandise going that way, and that makes me feel slightly better about it, but yeah. But the thing is, thank you. Your support is what makes it possible. And I will say, after this, if you've survived this far through this video, I get into the tech part. The tech part's coming a second. But I wanted to talk about all those things first. And I wanted to, with this slide up, to talk about my possible solution for the industry thing. It's a tough question, it really is. But I think you need to take it with a case-by-case analysis of what you've got. For shipbuilding, we are now establishing multiple yards, but realistically, the Type 31 yard is going to be producing the Type 32 and all light frigates from that point, at this point onwards. The OPVs go wherever we fit them. There are certain yards which can do things larger, so are going to get the Royal Fleet Auxiliaries and their work, and maybe even the Type 83s if they're large enough, but ultimately the Type 26 and the etc. yard is probably where the Type 83 will be built. Why? Because whilst we do have multiple yards, they've pretty much specialised down to the type. One produces the very complex warfighting vessels, one produces the more cheap and cheerful vessels, which are going to be used for presence mission and security and flak frigate duties and drone frigates and all the other duties that is going to come up. Or, sorry, I should say uncrewed warfare support vessel. Probably. There's all sorts of little points coming out. It's going to be really interesting seeing how some of the projects evolve that are being proposed. But realistically, Britain has an issue. In that with a load of single source suppliers, especially if you want to build domestically, which is, I would say, is always preferable for a nation, to build things domestically. If you want to do that, then you need to either accept you're going to be their sole profit provider, or you need to be prepared to nationalize them. You can't have it both ways. You can't expect a private company not to want to make a profit. That's their entire raison d'etre. That's what they do. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing bad with private companies seeking a profit. I have nothing against that. What I do have something against sometimes is the fact that some of these facilities building these ships and with all these things running on, is that we run them inefficiently. We pay them to run inefficiently so that they have more capacity to be surge building when we want them to, but in the meantime, we just pay them to build. That's one of the reasons why the aircraft carrier program, when we're building them, what you realize is we actually pay, in terms of construction funds, enough to build roughly 3.5 of the carriers we build, rather than the 2. 3.5, depending on how you do the sums. And that's the other thing, by the way, once you get into the government accounts. I always love it when people from the private sector who haven't worked in the government start looking at government accounts. They get absolutely bamboozled within 5 minutes. They go away depressed as anything because they realize that government accounting is arcane. It truly is. I have myself dealt with this as a local councillor when I was younger. I was a borough councillor back in Epsom a few years ago. And it's a lovely borough, but every year I was giving the opposition a budget speech. And every year I would spend weeks going backwards and forwards with the council finance team, listening to them, trying to understand and putting forward, going through their budget, analysing it, asking questions, and realising that so much of the budget is predicated on 10, 20-year plans when they really don't know what they're going to be doing within 12 months, because the government could change its idea on the funding model and suddenly all these plans are for naught. And there's a reason why councils get themselves into the financial issues they do. And then you realise that the whole of government is like this. That whereas companies and businesses tend to plan along lines of, we will keep this steadily growth, we're planning on investing here, growing this, keeping that steady, and then we'll react to events. Governments themselves sometimes cause their own events just by having a new bright idea. It's fun times. It truly is. This is also why I say always be very careful when someone's telling you a country's broke or a country's rich. Both of those positions can be equally untrue. Anyway, back into getting into the main topic. Now, the thing is, ultimately, when we're deciding what we're getting and we're investing in all these things, it's about balance, okay? One of the problems I have whenever I see people doing these things is they either want to go for a completely revolutionary force structure, which is going based around this new technology, which is going to change the world, and you sit there and go, have you looked at the history of warfare? Yes, new technologies have come in. Regularly they come in. Often they're adaptations of older ideas with the new technology available to make them better in some way. But rarely do they destroy the entire warfare. Usually what they do is the warfare adjusts and fits around them. And they become part of the warfare. One of the interesting things when aircraft were coming into existence and coming to service was, we often talk about the bombers or battleships. When you look at the early discussions, there was even discussions of bombers or artillery. Because surely a bomber is going to be better, and all these things would come through, and, well, it didn't. Artillery hasn't gone away. In fact, tube artillery, that's traditional artillery, is probably one of the things which is making the biggest comeback in recent years. Again, because it's showing its viability. The gun is making its comeback in naval forces and naval structure because, again, it's its viability. And one of the things about these systems which fire shells is they are very cheap in waging war terms to fire a lot of times. The amount of times I hear discussions about, the future missiles are going to be these hypersonic, highly maneuverable assets, and you sit there and go, good. Well, by now the person who you're asking for this is going to have probably
dollar or pound or euro signs or ruble signs or whatever in their eyes which are going to be taking them over, because you're asking for something which is going to be the cutting edge of cutting edge for probably the next 50 to 100 years of tech. Because when you're hypersonic, your turning circle is massive. So if you want to try and make that maneuverable, because of your speed, it's not turn it into mass you're turning it, it's the speed you're going. If you are literally covering the speeds that define you as being hypersonic, you're going quite far very quickly. So you start, let's say you take 3 or 4 seconds to turn, that's still going to be a very wide circle, wide radius for the maneuver. Unless you can get some really fancy stuff going, which we haven't yet seen in actual viability outside of some demonstrations. And that's the point ultimately. When you're designing ships or armed forces for actually fighting wars, you have to think about, well, we have to have a balance between the highest tech, which is great, and the mass we need, the quantity versus quality. You need enough of the quality and enough of the quantity to deliver the effect you need. It's also about balance of interests. And there are interests out there that you, again, can find a relatively large amount of details and, facts about. I've got some graphs from the trade stats for the UK here, come from the UK government's own materials. Always good to be able to use their own documents in a discussion about them. The fact that they publish them all and you can read them through really does help. But again, if we consider economic interest for UK, UK, broadly speaking, needs a stable world. Whether it's Europe or the rest of the world, the UK economy is pretty evenly divided, with roughly 40 to 45% EU trade and 55 to 60% global trade. So that's pretty much near enough even Stevens. So I'm sorry to those people who go, we need to trade with the world. We're already trading with the world. We're selling them as much as we can sell them. We could maybe sell them a bit more, but we're doing that already. We're already heavily internet connected. And those people, again, who want us to trade with Europe only, sorry again. We're already trading with them. A lot. We can't do much more. And yes, you could have all sorts of agreements, and they might finesse around the edges. But the fact is, the British economy is one of those global trading economies. We like that. That's good. We trade in goods. We trade in services. We both export and import goods and services, and we have all sorts of trade flowing around the world. So we're about as economically dependent on a stable world as a nation can be. We are. We are about as interconnected with the world as any nation can be. If there are issues in the world, if the old phrase is, America sneezes, the world catches a cold, and things like that. Well, for Britain, if there are sneezes around the world, Britain's getting a cold. Because Britain is that interconnected. And there is no benefit to being made completely dependent on long-haul trade or short-haul trade, i.e. Europe or the rest of the world. It really doesn't help either way. From a strategic perspective or a tactical perspective. Or certainly not from an economic perspective. You don't want to put your eggs all in one basket. You want to spread them about. To use that lovely old phrase. In cultural terms, Britain has a wide range of links with nations going on for centuries. This is not going to suddenly go away. It's just not. Britain also has a small other curse. It's a nation of resolve. And that means a nation we tend to expect, when we see problems in the world, our governments to do things about those problems and to be able to do things about it. And worse still, the governments tend to expect they can do something about it. The thing is, they don't always fund the ability to do it properly, but they do expect it to be done. When it comes to defence and security, well, we all know NATO, we've all heard of Five Eyes, there's also the Commonwealth. That is not so much a formal defence and security alliance, but again, it's quite important. If there are issues going off, if Commonwealth members are being attacked, Britain will probably want to do something. And that's an important soft power alliance as well. AUKUS, famously for nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. And the one which often gets forgotten of British alliances, but still very much there, the 5-power defence arrangements in Southeast Asia, involving Singapore and other allies in that area. There are all these arrangements going on around the world. So Britain is economically interconnected. It is connected by its word and its bond. It's connected for cultural reasons, and it is a historic leader of the world. And the trouble with being a world leader is sometimes, as with being any form of leader, you have to put the interests of those you lead ahead of your own personal interests. That's part of being a leader. If you have the burden of leadership, if you have the status of being a leader, you have to act like it. And that sometimes means putting the collective good ahead of your personal good. Doing something which helps the people you're leading out, but doesn't really work in your personal favour. And that is true for all levels of leadership. It just is. It always has been. For being a good leader. Being a bad leader means that very quickly people will stop following you. You'll find yourself in a situation where you're looking for people to support you, people to help you out, people to follow your instructions, and they just won't. And I would say when you're a medium power, and I would put Britain I would define Britain as a global power, or at least traditionally as a global power. There have been some recent cuts which do make me question that. But it is traditionally a global power. It has the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. It has the capability for global power projection, and that is true. Same as France. But they're still a medium power. Okay? The medium powers are divided up into global and regional powers. And sometimes the regional powers will be stronger on paper, but they're not able to project it globally. So usually we rank the global powers ahead of the regional powers. Because the regional powers are limited to their region, whereas the global powers can turn up where they want in the world and go, hello, are you paying us attention? Or, hello, you're doing X. This is causing us Y, Z, and F amount of troubles. So we'd like you to ABC now. Sometimes it's enough to just turn up and go, we're watching. Please don't do this. Because that will make us have to do something, and we don't want to have to do something. Sometimes you have to turn up and do something. Britain has experience of both. So do many other powers. So do many other powers. And that's the thing, it's about balancing with the interests. It's about balancing with your national needs. And yeah, Britain is an island nation off the coast of Europe. That gives it both a bit of distance, but also gives it an ability, a safety point. But that safety point only works if you're able to secure it. That safety point only works for you if you are able to take advantage of it. And being an island can be as advantageous as it can also be lonely and problematic. With that being said, let's move into the armed forces. Now, the Royal Air Force. I love them dearly. I do. I make some jokes about them occasionally, but I know how hard they work and how diligently most of them work. I might occasionally suggest that they are very good at finding decent hotels, but to be honest, if I ever do want a recommendation about a good hotel in anywhere I'm going to, I always do call my friends who are in the who've been in the Royal Air Force or who are in it, because if anyone will have found a decent hotel in the back of beyond, it will be them. They're quite. It's a unique skill. Okay, it's a unique skill. They have it. They are very good at it. But that small, disturbingly truthful joke aside, they have suffered from chronic underinvestment. And this is what I would say about the whole of British force structure moment. I'm not gonna, in this scenario, be starting to go, we need to do this massive new program, we need to do this, grand scheme. Most of what we need to do, at least in the next 5-10 years, is properly invest in the programs we got going. And yes, invest in time and analysis to work out what the future systems are going to be. But the things we need are things we can get into service in the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. That's what we need to be starting thinking about. We need to be growing our forces immediately. And future tech is lovely, it's attractive, it's, oh, that's so cool. Oh, just imagine what they'll be able to do. True, lovely. But at the moment, it's vaporware. At the moment, it's potential, not capable. Okay? And potential is lovely, but at the moment we need capable. We can build the potential later. We need the capability now. The Royal Air Force is short of tankers. It's got the Voyager fleet, but again, they are a unique private-public partnership. There are all sorts of things going on with the tanker fleet, but honestly, we need more of them. We're replacing the river joints, the RC-135s. We're probably going to need more airframes for that. We are going to need more airframes for that role. Eurofighters. Yeah. Honestly, we should probably be ordering some more. We should probably be making sure our fleet doesn't shrink, and if we can add in some extra squadrons, that won't be a bad thing, because they are working very hard with the air defense role moment. This is a picture of it with a Tu-95, a Russian bomber. Maybe not that advanced. Maybe the Soviet/Russian equivalent of the T-52, the B-52. But it's still there, still wandering around, still probing things, and still requiring a response. There's a whole discussion recently about whether the Royal Navy really should still be escorting Russian ships every time they go through the channel or pass close to British waters. And the point is, you do it because the first time you don't do it, they might do something you don't want them to do. It's a level of respect, but it also reflects the level of trust between nations. Do you trust them not to cause trouble, not to take advantage of not being watched to cause a problem, or to try and push closer, to try and get some intel, to try and cause embarrassment, to try and cause trouble? Because then get a headline. It's kind of like when we're talking about maintenance of aircraft and equipment, and the armed forces versus civilian mercantile life. Warships are not an aircraft like these and armored vehicles. They're not designed to just carry explosive systems. They're designed to make use of explosive systems. They are national assets, and when they have problems, especially warships, if they break down, it causes international news around the world very quickly. You want to over-maintain, you want to be slightly cautious, because A, you're going to wreck them in wartime, just using them, let alone with the use you're going to subject to, let alone actual possible war-fighting damage. But B, because if they break down, if they break down, it doesn't matter whether they break down in the Suez Canal or just in the middle of the Indian Ocean, it's going to cause international news. It's going to cause international embarrassment. You don't want to happen. If they have a bad day at the office, things which are designed to go boom in very deadly ways might go boom when they're not supposed to go boom. And so, this is why. The sensors, all these things need to be maintained, they need to be kept going. And that then brings me to the E-7 Wedgetail, the AWACS aircraft. They're the only one which fit the UK operating parameters available at the moment. They are. And whilst theoretically you could order another type, you could get it developed and all these things, that will take time. That will take time, money, effort, and honestly, we need more aircraft now. Whoever decided that the UK could get by with just 3 of those aircraft was living in a world which is far more pleasant than the one I inhabit. Far more pleasant. Realistically, you need to be able to maintain one of them for NATO operations, one of them constantly in the air for NATO operations, one of them constantly in the air for UK operations, and one available to surge around the world for any crisis you might need response to. And that's the bare minimum. So that would be at least a fleet of 9 aircraft in my book to cover maintenance, to cover the rotation of aircraft up in the air, to cover all the duties. But realistically and sensibly, we should probably be talking about 12. Currently we're down to buy 3. There is a big difference. That's also where I get into all these, because all these systems we either have existing personnel for, or we have existing mature procurement lines and development systems for. We could easily add to these fleets. Growing them is a very cheap way to grow the force and to grow your capability. Having more tankers, no one has ever complained since air-to-air refueling became a decent, viable thing to do, has complained, oh, I have too many tankers. You will never find, if you could find an air marshal who complained they had too many tankers supporting their operation and it was such a drag, please introduce them to me. I would be so surprised to meet that person. I really would. It's the same with airborne early warning aircraft. They're really useful. And there's a reason why both AWACS and tankers and maritime patrol aircraft and electronic warfare aircraft are pretty much targets numero uno for fighters to try and knock out, because their value is that great. They are key enablers of the force. And having so few in service, it undermines your entire force structure. It really does. And again, these are existing programs. Expanding them is not a major ask. It's something which is very viable on the funding we already have, because if you're expanding initial funding, you're not having to set up a new project office, you're not having to write new terms, you're not having to do anything that. You're just going, right then, we'd like to buy more of this asset we're already buying. What is a negotiation? What kind of facilities do we already have in place? What are we doing? And then the defense salesman's eyes will go, bing, bing, bing. But still, you're also in a position where you go, it cost me X amount to buy these. Now, I realize some of that was setting up the production facilities and the support for it. I'd like to now buy more of these units. How much is that going to cost me? And here's the really dirty little secret with defense that often doesn't get pointed out. The more you buy of something, the cheaper it gets per unit price as a rule. Because the development costs and the setting up of the initial infrastructure tends to be forward-loaded onto the first few units to make sure they get that money back and make sure they get a profit. So that means anything which comes after, you're literally just paying for the build. And you already got everything set up in training-wise to support it. Then we talk about the army. Well, the Army have things like the Boxer, under Procurement, the Ajax, the Challenger 3, and the Archer. And the British Army, I love them. They are very, very brave, but my lord, how they managed to get themselves into a mess over recent years. I would have personally said, when we were talking, when Britain was going for its structures, it needed a strike division, it needed an armoured division. So strike division to me is a medium cavalry force. Something which is medium cavalry. Something which can rapidly mobile to an area, rapidly transport itself to an area, and then when it gets there, can fight a decent battle holding action until heavier forces arrive. You need an armoured division, a properly structured one, and you need probably a decent infantry, a couple of decent infantry divisions to round out the force. It needs to be spread between regulars and reserves. I remember when first we were talking about getting the Boxer in, etc. I was very keen on, rather than the Boxer, going for the Super AV adapted variant of the adaptation of the Super AV, the Italian APC, which was being adapted by BAE for the US Marine Corps. And my argument for that was, whilst yes, it has less of the modularity and capability of the Boxer, it does have the option that we add in the Royal Marines, and we end up with 3 strike brigades, and we can build 3 strike brigades, rapid movement brigades, around these vehicles. It didn't get taken on, like CV-90 didn't get selected instead of Ajax. It didn't. But these are the systems we have. And if you are entering ideas of, well, we should cut Ajax and build CV-90 and all these things, I wouldn't disagree that I prefer CV-90 from the perspective of slotting into our partners and the people we're working with logistics trains, but that ship has sailed. It's now under production. It's now in construction, same with Boxer. And frankly, stopping and building and changing over new things is going to take too long. Now, we need the equipment now. I would say the most disappointing thing is the fact that Archer hasn't been procured enough of it. My view would have been, okay, yes, it's supposed to be interim until the Boxer RCH 155mm comes in service. Okay, that's a good idea, a good system. But how about what we do is we buy more of these, and then when the Boxer system comes into service, these get transferred over to the reserves. And we form up some reserve artillery forces, because artillery is turning out to be something which is pretty darn useful. And looking at the capabilities and profile of the Archer, I would argue that it would be perfect for reservist artillery force, reservist artillerymen. And it would give them a level of mobility which many of the reserve units, artillery units in the UK don't have, because many of them seem to use the light gun, the 105mm, which we're talking about in a bit when she gets to the Royal Marines. It would seem sensible. Also, if we'd kept to that sort of full armoured division of 3 armoured brigade structure, maybe with 1 brigade of reservists, maybe all 3 regular brigades, I think we could have done a reserve armed brigade. I think it would have been a sensible thing, but I think Britain often has a problem with its approach to reserves, especially something which has come about during the Cold War. The idea wars were going to be over very quickly, so you wouldn't even have time to mobilise reserves. It meant the reserves often got treated as a joke and not seriously. I think reservists are incredibly important for long war capability, and I think that's where you should focus them in on. I think you should focus expeditionary capabilities and the kind of force structure you need for things like peacekeeping and for rapid interventions should be focused on your regular forces and regular force structure, along with key capabilities and key specialisms. And I think your long war capability should be focused on your reservists, your expanded structure. What can we expand the structure with? What can we put in here that's going to be viable, that's going to give us the capability? And yes, it's often, if you want to get the best out of your reservists, you need to design a system which is going to allow them maximize their training capabilities and maximize the cross-transference of their civilian skills to their military life. But ultimately, what the British Army really needs is these programs which are running at the moment to be run properly and to be churning out. There is, honestly, the Boxer order probably needs to be doubled. There should be no reason why we still have those APCs in service that I talked about at the beginning. There should be no reason. The Ajax needs to be brought in service. The Challenger 3, no one's going to buy new main battle tanks at the moment, and they're upgrading the Challenger 3. And Britain's not going to run 2 battle tank fleets. They're not. Last time we did that was when we had the Chieftains and the Challengers in service together. And that was a long, long time ago. However, what I would like to see, especially with the Boxer coming into service, is a reattachment to the idea of tank destroyers. I have Boxers armed with anti-tank missiles and have them hopefully reloadable launcher systems from internally reloadable launchers so they can fire off multiple salvos, because that would be a very useful asset to have. And having flexible and having many of them in service which are able to launch, let's say, UAVs as well. One of the things I think we have to think about is that how are we going to make the future force work? And I didn't get into this much in the Royal Air Force because talking about UAVs and uncrewed systems is something I was planning on saving for the end, but I will talk about it now, to an extent. You've got to start thinking of what kind of level of uncrewed asset are you going to have. I could not understand the idea of why we would have any vehicle in the armed forces operating which doesn't have a drone dock and doesn't have drones which are able to fly off and provide them with little quick reconnaissance quadcopters and those little things. I cannot understand the concept of not having these sort of facilities and control facilities in these vehicles for that. It seems to me absurd. Because everything is about force maximization, especially when you're a medium power. It's about not punching above your weight, but being able to land a punch with such force and at such a critical nature, at such a critical juncture of your enemy, that you might be a middleweight boxer. But that heavyweight is going to remember every punch you landed in that fight, and you have a chance of winning it. And anyone else who's lighter than you is not going to want to be there for it. You might be a middleweight. And this is what we're coming to. I don't think we're yet at the scenario where you're going to have uncrewed systems, unmanned systems take over everything immediately. They're not. They're not at that level. The world is not that nice for them. But they are going to be increasingly part of warfare. They already are. They're already here. We need to start thinking about how it pertains to these systems. And the one thing I do like the idea is democratization. Is sort of every level has its own sort of type of drones. And I would say at the individual vehicle level, individual unit level, you should have the small drones available for reconnaissance, and they should be set up and ready to go. They should be set up and ready to go, ready to launch. So you just press a button and they're off. Maybe you have the tank destroyer system. Maybe it's loaded with drones which will fly around and then do what we tend to call them suicide drones. They then turn themselves into missiles and hit their targets after doing the reconnaissance. These are all good assets. If that's what you want to work with, that's sensible. What's really annoying to me is when you look at the British Army procurement, that was actually one of their plans 20 years ago. They just put it to one side, though, and decided it wasn't the future. So basically, the British Army needs to invest in what they're already doing, grow it as rapidly as they can, sort out their accommodation, sort out their training, sort out their pay, but most importantly, need to get their new vehicles into service, because there is so many issues with the vehicles we have. And that's before we even get into the whole Land Rover debate, which I am avoiding because that is a quagmire I have no wish to be sucked into. The Land Rover Defender was perfectly fine for its era. Trying to find a modernized vehicle that's going to be suitable for the roles we wanted to do is going to be an interesting political battle, because the trouble is about Land Rover Defender is it was around long enough, it's become iconic. It's become an icon. And I think it could end up becoming a political football, especially when we consider most of the options available for it are not British. And that is going to cause upset. And that is our own national fault. Multiple governments have not supported or sustained or nationalized or done whatever the options you can consider to maintain an industry that's going to be able to do this. Okay? As said earlier, you have options of, you either have to be ordering enough that you are going to be sustaining multiple companies, you either have to basically agree that you are basically going to be, that a private company is pretty much going to spend its entire life being fed by you. It's going to be you're going to be the government's baby. It's going to spend its entire life latching on and dependent upon the government providing milk, because it's entirely structured around supplying the government. The argument is Barron Furnace is a good example of this. Or you have to nationalise it, or you have to accept that you're going to be foreign ordering. And maybe you get that company to build a factory in the UK. Maybe. But you have to remember that the money from that factory, the money that they're taking in profit, that isn't staying in the country. And that's always a problem when it comes to defence spending, because it's usually quite large amounts. Because usually they're concentrated contracts. You see, various other parts of government can get away with it, because whilst they could still be in the aggregate buying the same amount from a foreign provider, it's lots of little contracts, so they don't make for a big meaty headline. But defence tends to make for a big meaty headline. Which brings us to the Royal Navy. Now, here's where I do start to spend some more money. Again, its programs need to be expanded. It needs to have crew. Part of getting the pay better, part of getting the accommodation better is hopefully that's going to allow you to retain more people, but also recruit more people. Well, that's great, but that means we need to make sure the Type 32 class, the ones that follow on from the Inspiration class, oh god, I hate that name, are actually ordered and on their way. The Type 26 class, we need more of them. 8's not going to be enough. 8 is not going to be enough. They are our premier anti-submarine warfare hunters. If we are not ordering a third batch of at least 4 to round out the force up to 12, we are going to be in trouble. Notice I haven't even mentioned Type 83 on this. That's because the Type 83 is something which is probably going to be ordered. It's going to be designed in this Parliament, it's going to be set out in this Parliament, but it's not going to be ordered till next Parliament at least. In fact, honestly, considering the existing pace of construction for the Type 26s, I would not be surprised if they don't have free space for them to be built. If they do go with BAE Systems Glasgow, till at least 2032. Possibly slightly earlier, but probably about 2030. It's going to be definitely in the 2030s. And that's if they designed everything and gone with everything off the shelf. That's the only way they're going to be there that quickly. So actually there will probably be space to build the Royal Navy more of these. Because currently they are taking 5 years to lay down, from laying down to launching. And It's basically a 10-year program to go from laying down to commissioning of these ships. That could be sped up a bit. It could be sped up a bit. There is a measure of paying that yard to keep that yard capability and higher going. And yes, they've upgraded the yard at the same time. They've done all sorts of things to make the yard better and improve it. And those are good things for the future. But yeah, we could probably crank in some more units at that point. And if you want proof that they could do, look at the Norwegians are potentially going to be ordering from that same yard at the same time. And there is an argument that it will not disrupt the British production line at all, with the Norwegians ordering from there, because of the pace of construction the British yard is currently doing. And you've got CETUS, the XLUV program. These things, they're really cool. We need they are uncrewed submarines. They've got modules and options, and they are something which probably we should be pushing more into. We should really be pushing more into, because they are going to be a future capability. They're going to be a capability enhancement for the full structure. Intelligence gathering, ASW warfare, that's anti-submarine warfare, all these things they are going to be critical for. But the final thing I'm going to say here for this, and this is something I would really like to be put forward for the SDSR, and really like to be considered in terms of naval terms, is I would love there to be a third Queen Elizabeth class carrier, but that ain't going to be happening anytime soon. We ain't in that kind of scenario. I would love us to be, instead of getting the multi-role ships, to be actually getting some LHDs and things as well. But again, I don't think I can persuade the government of that necessity right now. What I would like to see, though, and I think this is a lesson of the Vanguard class and the Resolution class before it, and all these things, in terms of the SSBNs, is that we need to build more than 4 Dreadnoughts. I would like to propose that we build 6. And I have a reason for this. I want 6 to be built, and 2 will be rolled as SSGNs with inserts in their ballistic missile tubes. We can do this. We literally have designed insert systems for these tubes, because the Americans have used them, and you can literally insert them, and there is designs for inserts which go in, and you can pull them out when you need to. And the reason I would do this is because Britain needs a strike enhancement in its force structure. It's not going to have enough astutes or AUKUS boats or whatever the SSN is that comes along to provide the aggregate strength which the US Navy is seeking to replace its SSGN fleet of old Ohios. Furthermore, the Royal Navy needs insurance if they want to keep 4 boats going for a long term, especially as what has happened with the Vanguard class, where they've been extended because of delays in the astute build and all the other problems that build up. It helps to have further depth in your force structure. Now, with 4 boats, you can normally guarantee 1 at sea on patrol, 1 available to surge, 1 in deep refit, and 1 in other training and other options. But as they get older, that becomes more and more difficult, and boats have a hull life. If you can spread out the tasking over 6 boats, and have 2 normally rolled as SSGNs, 2 out of 4 of them, but if necessary, okay, frigate, one of the SSBNs has bashed into a French boat again. Let's say I hope that never happens. Touch wood, it never happens again, but it happened once, so let's use that example. Okay, well that's got to go into unexpected long-term refit. That's fine. That's now going to be administratively rolled to the SSGN force, and one of the SSGNs is going to be plucked out of its duties and have its inserts taken out, and it's now going to be into the ballistic missile force. And the same, if you have issues, you now have something spare in the force. You have something which is useful tactically and strategically for operational needs, if when it's available, but you also have something which can fill in for your critical national security asset, your strategic deterrent. And if you decide you need to surge your strategic deterrent, it's easier. If you need to feel that the situation has reached the point at which we can't afford to just have one boat at sea anymore, we need to have two boats at sea. With 6, you can do that for a short time. You can do that for quite a while with 6 boats. So the thing is, this is where I will be putting some more money in. But again, it's kind of like I've been putting more money into the Royal Air Force and the Army. I'm expanding existing programs. Because those programs are there. This is where I can spend money most viably. Where I can deliver the most bang for my buck, because I already know how much they cost, and I'm adding on more to existing orders, which means I'm not paying for development costs, I'm not paying for research, I'm not paying for training, these things. I'm just expanding the forces using existing equipment. It's very conventional. It's a very 1930s, late 1930s approach to the expansion of British Armed Forces. Why does the Royal Navy not pick to go for its new high-pressure boilers at that point? Because they're expanding the forces and they've got lots of people trained on the existing boiler type. To go for the very high-pressure type, the equivalent to what the Americans and the Germans are using, would have been a bottleneck in terms of training, logistics, and sustainment. They decide against it for that reason. It would have been cool, though. But it was the sensible decision to take at the time, ultimately, when you're looking at the force structure as a whole. And there are people who are not going to like that idea. But again, it's 2 extra boats on a 4-boat class to make it up to a 6-boat class. It's going to provide you with extra crew capacity, extra focus on that, but it's also going to provide you with some units which are generally useful for operational needs. Because if you're going, right then, I really need some extra strike for the initial opening of an operation. Oh, I can sneak something in really close. Now, because these are designed to disappear into water. Can sneak in close, can fire a lot of cruise missiles, and get out. By memory, they usually, the inserts I think are 7 Talons, 7 Tomahawks, into one of the tubes. And I'm not sure, it might be more than 7, but that would still, the 7 times 12 would still make for 84 Tomahawks. Or whatever they're succeeded by, as a strike capability, and that's pretty decent. For a power like Britain, for a nation like Britain, that's a capability. And that would be something which other nations would be forced to think about, because whilst they can see where the carrier is, and the carrier is the ongoing strike asset that you can resupply and replenish at sea, and that's the advantage of a carrier, by the way. Every time someone comes back to me and goes, oh, carriers, they have no use in modern warfare, I go, do you like aviation? Do you like aircraft? Are they useful? Well, yeah, crewed or uncrewed, it doesn't really matter. Carrier can sustain both. But what the big thing a carrier can do at the moment is we haven't yet worked out how to resupply our VLS at sea effectively, coherently, consistently, in all the places we need to do it. We haven't. If you want a good example of what to show that we haven't, have a look at operations which have been going off a case of in the Red Sea and that area, and the Suez, with all the crisis going on with the Houthis currently. How many times have the American destroyers, and the American fleet is probably the best and most equipped and most resourced fleet of any nation in the world at this current time, how many times have those destroyers replenished their VLS at sea rather than going into harbour? The answer's not. Once they start doing it, that's when it's a viable ongoing capability. Until then, it's a nice little tested demonstration of what could be. Well, you can restock an aircraft carrier at sea. And that's your outer, with its aircraft, that's your outer air defense, your airborne early warning, your outer strike capabilities. That's a pretty important part of your force actually being able to sustain and operate itself. Add in something like this, providing initial opening strike capability from very close to the enemy coast with a surge of missiles. That's a useful asset. And for that, you would be buying the 2 cheapest Dreadnought class vessels you would buy. The 2 cheapest. Because units 5 and 6 would be the cheapest options. With that in mind, I should point out that the program is estimated to be roughly 38 and, well, nearly 39 billion pounds in lifetime cost for the 4 units as of 2023 poundage. Now, that of course equates to a certain amount per unit, roughly a little over 9, well, a little under 10 billion pounds per unit. But the thing is, if you added on 2 more units, you'd be surprised that the per unit price would decrease dramatically. Because that program cost includes all the infrastructure needed to sustain 4 vessels, all the research and development needed for 4 vessels, all the crew training facilities, all those systems for those 4 vessels. Adding on 2 more doesn't increase those requirements, doesn't add anything to the research costs. The others are mostly already paid for. You're just going to increase the number of people going through them. In terms of facilities, in terms of dockside facilities, we actually have that space because the Royal Navy used to be running a far bigger nuclear submarine fleet than it currently is. Just look at how many old boats we have stored in various yards for decommissioning. Yes, we'd have to do some investment to bring those facilities online, but it would not be the same as it would not be the same that it's going to add on nearly 10 billion or another 20 or nearly 20 billion onto the program. You're probably looking a lot less than that, which is going to drop the per unit cost. These things are very complicated systems. If you're spreading the research and development and all the costs of designing the power plant and the hull and everything over 4 units, they're going to be very, very costly. The more you build, the cheaper they get per unit. And the more the program makes economic sense, actually. Then we're into the Royal Marines. The Royal Marines. So why are the Royal Marines not being included under the Royal Navy here? Well, because, to be honest, when we start talking about amphibious warfare, we're starting to get into joint procurement, you're starting to get into the joint systems, and it's a bit funny, so it needs its own area. Plus, it also often needs to be explained what you need. You need both ship-to-shore connectors, like the LCU Mark 10 here, the big one, and of course the LCVP Mark 5, and there's also a hovercraft which we traditionally use called the Griffin, or landing craft air cushion, because no one can call anything by a simple name when you can create a whole new phraseology and standard framework to go for it. No, honestly, it is part of NATO. NATO is often more about a standards and linguistics organization than it is anything else. That is how the alliance works, to get things to work together, by having common standards and common linguistics. Now, the Royal Marines have in many ways been the force which has suffered most with the end of history. We can debate who has suffered the most in the end of history, but the Royal Marines has seen themselves turned from an amphibious expeditionary force into a raiding force, which is several steps back from what they were. Yes, they could do raiding, but the thing is, they were a full brigade. They were a full brigade's capability that you could land anywhere in the world, anytime you needed to. And various things have mitigated against this as an idea. People go, well, what about some anti-surface ship missiles? Well, they had those in the Falklands War. Ah, yes, but they didn't work that well. They still had them. And they didn't. Well, part of the reason they didn't work that well is because of the various systems taken to mitigate against them. Again, just having a system doesn't mean it's going to necessarily work. The enemy gets a vote. That's both if you procure the system and if they procure the system. You get a vote, they get a vote. You can try and adjust your systems to adapt that around it. You can pick where you're landing. The classic example in the Falklands War was what Trump's ex said: rock, mountain, geography. It's annoying, but it does. And it's much the same in a lot of other scenarios. You work your way around systems. You pick your routes based on often what's the least worst option and what's the one you can most make your systems work for you against the enemy. Now, is that going to be 100% effective? No, it isn't. It isn't. The Royal Navy lost enough ships in the Falklands War, they will testify. They worked through, it wasn't always 100% effective. But the thing was, they did it well enough, they could support the Marines and later on the Army when they arrived and were inserted, well enough that they could win. And that's the point of amphibious operations. But these things all work if you have a large enough ships to support them. And whilst I quite like the MRSS, and we'll be talking about that, I do not see that as the centrepiece of amphibious power projection. Neither are the aircraft carriers the centrepiece for carrier projection. Now again, I don't think I'm going to be able to change this in the next few years. I doubt, although I would love to see this SDSR stop the sale of Albion and Bulwark, the current government has committed too much of their political, what could I say, too much of their political capital to it. It was an easy win for them to make savings at the beginning when they came in, a high profile, oh, we don't need to do this anymore, and now they're looking at the world as more complicated again. And it's very difficult for them to row it back. It's very, very difficult for them to row it back. And distributing the force out to smaller ships does help if you buy enough ships. You probably need a lot more than 6. Probably looking at least 8 to 12. We're talking about those later though. But I would still like to have some centerpieces to grip us around that. And I would say myself, if I was the Royal Navy, and if longer term, it won't be SDSR 2025, but it'll probably be SDSR maybe 2030 if they're lucky, maybe earlier, and maybe as part of the program of construction which is going along with the Type 83s, try and get something which is of the LHD variety, a modified Trieste design. I do love the way a number of people go, Britain should have bought an LHD like the Trieste rather than the aircraft carriers, and you go, look at the number of aircraft they can operate. Look at the scenarios you want to operate in. The Trieste are an excellent design for what the Italians need them to be. They are wonderful, and the Trieste is a lovely ship. It is a really great ship. But for the scenarios you're talking about, replacing the Queen Elizabeth class with the Trieste, you're in trouble. What you should be looking at, though, is the Trieste is a perfect adjoinment to that force, adjoinment to that capability. Having a couple of Triestes replacing Albion and Bulwark as the core of the amphibious force, maybe even 3 such vessels, they can operate all the same aircraft as the Queen Elizabeth class, so they can operate as forward ships. Well, the thing is, you could load the Trieste fully of amphibious ships, and you don't need to even include F-35s in its air group. But your F-35s could land and take off and refuel and generally be supported from the Trieste as part of the task group. So you get a second flight deck. in effect, for that. Or you could, if they're doing an independent operation off the coast of Africa or somewhere else in the world, you could include some F-35s in their air group. You can tailor the air group like you can tailor the air group with the Queen Elizabeth class. And the thing is, having these assets is that they are one-stop shops for the ship-to-shore connectors, the logistics and stores, the personnel, and the support assets. That is what they are. And things like the light gun, the 118, 105mm light gun, it's a wonderful system, but it needs to be got ashore. It's basically helicopter mobile. Same with the BVS-10 Viking, and here you can see some of the mortars operating from them. And whilst I would have loved the Royal Marines to, as I've said earlier, my contention when we were looking at what 8x8 or what wheeled APC to get was the Super AV variant of the Super AV as variant, the BAE variant of the Super AV, yes, being British for US Marine Corps, because then you could have had the Royal Marines as a 3rd Strike Brigade, and the Royal Marines could have used that capability. I would love to see them get something like that, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. But realistically, they do need to be a full brigade. They do need a full brigade of strength. They do need that 3rd Commando. They need the force of the structure, and you need the lift capacity for it, because having a brigade as a Fiat entry force is a useful thing. That provides you the capability for deployment. Should you need to reinforce allies by rapidly deploying something into a facility which can't easily be cut off. We can use, we talk about cyber attacks and things cutting off ports. You can't cyber attack a beach. You can't. You can do lots of things to a beach, but you can't do deniable things to cut a beach off from allies coming ashore in a nation. If it's time of grey area where there's not yet active war or anything like that, you cannot close that beach. You mine it, well, that's an active war, and you've now opened up the full front of actual full-on conflict. So that's the thing. We have to start thinking smart about our forces and our resources, especially if we want to do conflict management. That's deterrence, by the way. Conflict management is the catch-all phrase for conventional deterrence, where you manage a conflict. You manage the risk of conflict. You try and prevent it coming about before it happens. And sometimes the trick for that is deploying a carrier battle group. Sometimes that's deploying a surface ship. And sometimes it's having some Royal Marines turn up ashore very quickly in large numbers to exercise with the allied partner. And it's just that is sending a message. And let's be honest, sending a message like that might cost some money, but it's a lot cheaper than fighting a war. And one of the problems for Britain is that we do have very much global interests. I know there are those who would like to believe that we can literally close the borders or close the door at the channel and just concentrate internally. And there was a time you could have possibly done that with the British Kingdom, or the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, the days of William the Conqueror are over. They've been over for a long time. We've been a globalized economy, a global trading economy, for the best part of the last 6 centuries. In reality. Arguably longer than that, considering some of the trade networks which were left behind by the Romans. And even before, which possibly even predate them. This is the reality of what you were dealing with as a strategic situation. And the thing is, you can't ignore that. And part of that means we want our goods to be able to traverse the world peacefully, which means we need allies securing their regions. And part of the quid pro quo of an ally looking after your bits when your stuff goes through there is if someone looks like they're going to up the ante beyond the allies' ability to deal with it, you support them. And in return, they support you. Alliance structures are great, but the old phrase is God helps best those who help themselves. Well, in alliance structure works best for those who can do the most themselves. So therefore bring the most to the table for the other allies to rely on, and also are least likely will only call in the allies when they need it. So that is a good relationship to have. If you want to have a positive relationship in alliance, you need to be strong yourself. And the Royal Marines, their useful traditional thing is supporting, of course, our Scandinavian allies. That's traditionally they've been towards the northern flank, the Arctic operations of NATO, and that's usually been their focus. But they've also done things in, of course, the Falklands War, in Africa, Sierra Leone, and all sorts of operations around the world. They have been there. They are Britain's theatre entry force more often than not. Yes, the parachute regiment is also often there, often rapidly deployed, but again, you need both. One is what I can quickly send in 24 hours, but I'd rather keep that for a crisis which I haven't seen coming. A crisis which I can see coming, I prefer to send the Royal Marines on a ship for, because the thing is, if they're based on a ship, then if situation turns out I decide I don't want to get involved because my allies being interesting, I don't have to. They're aboard a ship. They're not in the Allies' territory. I don't have to withdraw them from within the Allied territory. So, if I can, I prefer to deploy Royal Marines. I need to have both to have the options. But I prefer the Royal Marines. And that leads us to the joint procurement situations, which are things like the P-8 Poseidon, up the top there, and the F-35 Lightning. Now, the P-8 isn't technically a joint procurement, but I often think it should be. I think it should be a joint Royal Navy, Royal Air Force procurement, because it has to interface with both. And whilst technically they're all Royal Air Force, they work more often with the Royal Navy than they do with the rest of the Air Force. And when you were setting up the Joint Force Harrier that became Joint Force Lightning for the F-35, and that's a joint procurement between the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, and the combined helicopter force and all the other systems, why the P-8 Poseidon, why Long Range Maritime Patrol was not made another joint structure, I do not know. Because to me, it would have been sensible. And having only one squadron of them is not enough. Honestly, for Britain, we need probably... Well, I would say you need at least a flight base down in the Falklands. I'd say you probably should have a flight base in the Mediterranean, in Gibraltar, to help look at the Mediterranean. And I'd probably reckon you need about a couple of squadrons in the UK, one based up in Scotland and one based down in Cornwall. And I'd say that force should be 50-50 Royal Navy, Royal Air Force. Because you need both forces to provide the level of experience to get the most out of that force. You really do. Also, if it was a joint structure, it might make it less prone to being cut. It might make it unlikely that we have a scenario like the Nimrods and the gapping. Because we didn't just gap carriers, we gapped maritime patrol and all sorts of things. Which seems so sensible from an economic perspective at the time, but were really bad strategically and security-wise. Really bad. And again with the F-35B. Now, there are all sorts of people talking about kill switches for the F-35B. There is no such thing, no kill switch in them. There is, however, a logistical issue, in that they are on a combined system. And if allies want to muck around with that, they can. But at the moment, because of the scenario Britain is in, short of reactivating a Harrier force which doesn't exist, to be reactivated, your only option for getting the most out of the carriers we've got and the other systems and maybe a Trieste class LHD in the future is the F-35B. And we can discuss the points about whether or not making the carriers Cadabar would be sensible. But the thing is, if you want to do a Cadabar conversion of the carriers with emails and etc., again, you're going to be buying the systems from America, because that's where the emails come from, and they've got gas turbines. They haven't got steam power plant, so they can't use steam. They can't use a steam catapult. So you're going to have to wait for those emails to be available. That's going to take time. You're going to have to then install them. That's going to take time. It's not going to be a quick procedure. You're going to need to rejig the power supplies and everything around the vessel. And you're probably talking about both carriers being each out of service for about 12 to 18 months with the process of it. And then you've got to start a whole new carrier pilot training program and acquire a whole new type of aircraft. I know, it's a lovely thing. You will hear people say they need to be Catabar carriers. That is the best system, I do agree. But best for Britain, especially if we could get some Trieste LHDs, I'm not so sure, because then we'd have 5 ships that could all take the same aircraft versus 2 that could take one type of aircraft and 3 that could take another. It makes more sense for a medium power at that point to just stick with the B, because we have platforms which can use it. Under current circumstances, I don't think we can afford to have both carriers out of service for most of the next 2-3 years. I don't think we can. I don't think having 2 carriers was enough in the first place, but we've now got to make the best of the system we've got, and I don't think we're getting a 3rd carrier based on the sensibility of it. But that's part of the reason why I've suggested the SSGNs in the Dreadnought class, why I've suggested the Trieste class with the Royal Marines, and one of the reasons why I'm going to sit here and tell you that, yeah, Eurofighters, F-35B, and some form of UCAV should be high up on our procurement list and ordering, and we should be trying to get them in and service as quickly as possible. And if there are powers who are feeling like they don't want to, no longer want to procure the F-35B, that's fine. Can we buy their slots? Can we buy their slots? I'd be quite happy to. I'd also, quietly probably, look into what kind of methodology we can put in place to stop ourselves running into issues with mission tasking and profiling, and logistics stores. For one, we need to stockpile. For the other one, I'm not sure what the solution is. I honestly don't know. But I do know that it works out just as badly for everyone else if you break down those systems. If you break down the logistics system, the thing about the F-35 is it's not just multi-state in America procurement, it's multi-ally procurement. There are lots of components which come from other nations, and it could cause trouble. So I don't see that as let's put it this way, I don't see that as a sensible option for any government to ever try and use to coerce allies or partners. But this is part of the problem you have since the 1990s and the end of the Cold War and the end of history and unipolar world theories and all the ideas that came forward. Is nations have got themselves into a lot of trouble where they're over-dependent. And it's never a good thing to be over-dependent on people. Think about your friends, think about your family. If you're over-dependent on someone in that group, they can feel burdened, and you can feel weak, and that can lead to all sorts of disagreements and aggravations, and can ruin a friendship or ruin a family. And it's the same with nations and alliances. You need a level of independence. Yes, it's fine to have to buy other people's kit because you can't produce it all yourself as a medium power and a small power. Those are your options you have. But you have to make sure you have enough kit and you have enough capabilities that you're able to independently operate within your own interests against a likely equivalent threat. And that's the sensible option. That's the scenario you've got to be in. So that brings us to space. And yes, space for the UK is technically, Space Command is supposed to be part of the Air Force
but it's also sort of a joint command, and that's why there's an Army Major General currently in charge of it for the UK. And it includes the Skynet satellite system. So I'm sorry if this is a shock to people. Skynet is real. The British have it. It's our communications satellite system and has been for many, many years. But it did all get set up after Terminator came out. And no one noticed. We are now onto Skynet 6, I think, coming up. And again, for this scenario, we don't have enough comm satellites. We don't have enough satellites for the UK as a whole. One of the problems, again, of dependence here, when satellites have become such an important part of global communications, of drone management, that's uncrewed aircraft and ships, all these things require satellite communications to really get the best out of them and operate them, coordination of forces around the world, intelligence gathering and sharing, all these things are satellite dependent. You cannot afford to not have a significant independent capability. A significant independent capability. Especially for a nation with the interests Britain has. Now, this is not cheap, but we already have the systems in place. We're talking about expanding on existing systems. And you've got people like Surrey Satellite Technologies, etc., who produce excellent systems. So Britain is in a wonderful position that domestically we do have the capability to produce this equipment ourselves. Why we don't have enough of it, I do not know. But again, it's probably due to the fact that actually having a decent SDSR, which is not about cutting government defence spending to justify spending on whatever the governments want to spend money on because they think it's more popular and going to win them more votes, versus spending money on defence so we've actually got the level of security we need for the level of exposure and risk we have. Because again, defence spending is insurance. It's about prevention of conflict and insurance in case conflict breaks out. So it's those two things. You are basically a company which is, in terms of defence spending, it is a combination of your security guards, your alarms, locks and bolts on the door, and your insurance. That's the equivalent of defence spending. And if you think about it, if you're a company which has got enough value of it as a nation state has, these things make sense to have. And the satellites? Well, they're your integrated communication system or an integrated communication system, your spy cameras, all those things, that are looking after your place. CCTV, not spy cameras. I should call them by the name they're supposed to be, not the cool name. Should do. And that leads us to the civilian enablers. Now, the thing is about civilian enablers and this sort of logistics level, I'm talking about the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, I'm talking about things like Stirling Castle, which is our undersea cables monitoring ship and critical part of modern operations, but also things like Fort Victoria, which is our currently only supply ship, and apparently the replacements for her are going to take 7 years to build. Yes, you didn't mishear me, 7 years to build. Then we got the Tide-class tankers. By the time they actually get the fleet solid support ships in service, they'll probably need to replace them as well. Because they'll just have reached that age. And we've got the multi-role strike ship program, which is theoretically going to replace the Bay-class, Argus, Albion, Bulwark. Yeah. And we've got railways. And all these things are necessary because the thing is about Britain is that its strength often lies in the fact it can get forces there. Other people can make promises. Other people can make nice noises. Other people might have bigger armies or bigger air forces or even sometimes bigger navies, but they can't deploy them anywhere. They can't operate them freely worldwide. They are limited in where they can be. Britain's traditional advantage has always been its network of bases and its network of logistics assets and infrastructure that supports it. This, unfortunately, has a habit of being cut by, well, if we consider defence spending, Usually the criteria is what's the bare minimum they can get away with. And the headline people are going to focus on is tank numbers, not number of tank transporters. The thing people are going to focus in on is number of escorts, not number of supply ships. They're going to focus on your number of fighters, not your number of tankers. And that's a problem. Because if you're defining defense policy not by matrix, which is the system which they like to use now, where you draw up a list of the threat level you're prepared to accept, the amount of risk you're prepared to accept, and this is what you need in terms of capabilities to sustain to prepare against that risk. You're defining it as the risk is what will the public not like if I get rid of it? What will the public be upset about? Albion and Bulwark were for many years the Royal Navy's flagships at alternate points. They were a critical part of our capability in reaching around the world, and now they've been got rid of. A capability which was essential. The Amphibious Task Group, the brigade strength, the Royal Marines, all these things has been, we don't need this anymore. Why? Future wars won't require it. I'd say, honestly, the thing is about a brigade strength amphibious lift capability is you don't necessarily have to use it to lift the brigade. You can be deploying other smaller forces in multiple places in the world at the same time. That's the point. A brigade lift capability is not we're necessarily going to be lifting a brigade. It means we have the option to, if we need to. But it means we can guaranteed whenever we need to position that commando, which is basically a battalion. And you can have that commando reinforced by elements to make it up to a battle group. Things like maybe some armor from the army, maybe some light armor, maybe some other systems, maybe some artillery, some engineers, some logistics. So it's a fully capable, independent force. Maybe that's what you need to have, a posturing and a place. And I think, honestly, the multi-role strike ship programs are a really great idea as additions to this. Honestly, if I had been designing the system, the British would probably be getting 3 LHDs for the Royal Navy and 3 Bay-class, basically copy and repeat, with the addition of a permanent hangar facility built in them. Why we allowed, I don't know which functionary of cost and efficiency to delete the hospital and the hangar bay, the hangars, and that sort of the gym deck as well, hospital, gym, and hangar from Albion and Bulwark, let alone the hangars from the Bay class. I will never understand. I will never know. Oh, we have an aircraft carrier, so we don't need hangars on our amphibious ships. This is the problem we've had since 1990. We've had a lot of people with bright ideas who think they can save some pennies. But they cost pounds. They cost pounds. The maintenance issues of not having a proper hangar with a proper crane set up and a proper lighting so you can do proper maintenance on the helicopters when they're on a long-term deployment and maintain your capabilities properly and safely. They add up. Those costs add up to far larger, far more prolonged, far more expensive refits of those helicopters when they come back. We'll never need to do it. We now have it going back to back to back to back, and you're spending more money almost every single time on those helicopter maintenances than you would have spent actually building in the hangar facility in the first place. Because what is the hangar but an extra a bit more metal? And yes, it's got a crane and some storage space in it, but honestly, when you're dealing with a multi-thousand-ton ship, the amount of extra steel, the amount of extra equipment you're talking about is not going to break the bank by any stretch of the imagination.
scenario I tend to use is it's like buying a car and going, you know what, I'm going to save money. How? I'm not going to buy the windows. Because it's sunny. So I don't need them. Good luck every time it rains. And then, if we look through the rest of these ships, 7 years to build the fleet solid support ship, and they haven't even started on the multi-role strike ship program. This is my other big problem. They are literally getting rid of Albion and Bulwark, and they haven't even started construction, and they haven't even selected a design really for the multi-role strike ship program. 7 years though for the fleet solid support ship. 7 years before the first one enters service. 7 years. We're talking most of a decade for a Type 26 and Type 31s. And I would love to say these ships are massively complicated compared to their predecessors. They are more advanced, yes, but honestly, the answer is we are paying yards to build slowly because we are not putting enough production through them to keep them open otherwise. To justify keeping them open. We are building ships slowly, less efficiently, because that keeps yards open in case we need to surge production for a war. So it's a sensible scenario. But the answer is this. How about just upping the numbers a bit so we're actually more prepared when a war comes, if a war comes? Actually, here's the thing. If we're slightly stronger, we might be able to deter a war before it happens, and that's a lot cheaper than fighting one. And that's not arguing for, and I've seen them with the fantasy fleets that sometimes come out, and the fantasy armies, and the thing of something of dozens of divisions or an air force which rivals the Royal Air Force of World War II in terms of a number of aircraft and all these things. No. That's taking a sensible approach to existing programs. If to stretch the build out enough over enough period, you have to have 7 years before the first one enters service. What happens if you order 4 of the ships? Can you stretch the building of 4 of them out over that build time and actually have some enter service earlier, so we don't just depend upon Fort Victoria, the sole supply ship we have? Stirling Castle, there's only one of her. Considering all the undersea data cables our economy is dependent upon, the service industry, the financial services industry I'm talking about, must be, let alone the legal services industry, must be having kittens. Because one is basically none when it's not available. And the other thing about having a massive force, and more ships, more tanks, more of these planes and aircraft, is a larger force presents people with more opportunity for long-term employment. I remember having a discussion with some of the senior officers from the Falklands War, and how many of them left the service of the Royal Navy and the Army after the Falklands War was over. And we're talking very senior officers here. And about a year later, the armed forces got back in contact and said, well, actually, we'd really like to have kept your experience in service because you've just been down to conflict. We'd like you to come back. Oh, good. So how long do you want us to be back for? Well, we can't guarantee your long-term employment. The force size doesn't justify that. So I've been out a year. You let me retire in the first place. They're basically armed. So imagine I'm them. Not speaking as one of them, but I'm, not claiming I'm one of them, but speaking as one of them, sort of in the sort of descriptive way. Just clarifying that before someone does something weird in the comments and goes, "You're pretending to be something you're not." I'm not. I'm retelling their account as they explained to me. Just imagine the situation I'm in. I have children. I have left my career. I have started a new career. You want me to come back for maybe leave the job I'm in, come back for maybe a year, maybe a couple of years. You can't tell me, and then I have to relocate my family for that time, and then we'll probably have to leave again and have to find another job that much older, that much. Surprisingly, not a single one of them said yes, and other methods had to be found to try and get their experience. Not a single one said yes. And it's similar today with people looking. You've got skilled candidates who are looking, and this is one of the figures of why the drop-off is at 30. Okay, if I'm 30, that's a good age to go get a new job. I've got a bit of career behind me. I've got a bit of experience. I can probably go get a new job quite easily. If I wait till 35, that might get more difficult. If I wait till 40, it could get even more difficult. And so that starts going through your head. And what are the odds of me being promoted? What are the odds of me being promoted? The Royal Navy needs more ships, the Royal Air Force needs more aircraft, and the Army needs more of pretty much everything. And that's the sad truth. But these civilian enablers have suffered even more. And the thing is, you're going to need them. This is the UK defence spending as a percentage of GDP since 1692. Here it is. And when we look at it, you start to realise that, okay, the UK doesn't always spend a lot of money on defence. And at no point have I been claiming the UK should spend a lot of money, and I haven't been arguing for a lot of money, I would argue. But the thing is, we are almost at a record low point. Adjusted for inflation, we are looking at the nadirs of the 1870s, realistically, to start thinking about a point at which we were lower. You can go back a bit farther as well. When you average it through that period, those periods and times, consistently the British are usually between 3.5% and 4% in times when they are successfully deterring conflict. 3 to 4%. Yes, the Cold War was a higher period of spending, and of course World War I and World War II were massive. Currently, we are below 2.5%, and the government of current time is promising to increase it to 2.5% and eventually to 3%. I don't like using percentages as an argument. I think it covers up a lot. You can claim a lot. I've seen them adding in the War Graves Commission into the sums to make it up to 2.5% and try and make it into this, that, and the other, how much they're spending. That's why I don't like percentages of GDP as an analytical. I have it there to show you as an example. Because, say we're not doing necessarily bad. We're not doing well enough, but we're not doing bad. The problem, I think, is that in those periods, Britain wasn't exactly prepared for war. They weren't. The British government has an unerring track record for about the last 500 odd years. I'd go back further, but it takes time to adjust once you're into a feudal government system. Of not being prepared for conflict. Of not being prepared for the wars it fights. But I'd say one of the problems we have then is, are we even more unprepared than we are traditionally? And I would say never before have we suffered from such a dearth of infrastructure. if you're looking at the British force structure and the British armed forces, basically from this point backwards, there is always far more infrastructure for them to call upon. There are many, many yards. One of the interesting, fun things is the UK government is still going around paying for yards, shipyards that is, to close in the run-up to World War II. Up to about 1937, they're even offering to pay a yard, which is then used for construction, 1937, to close, because they're trying to consolidate industry. And yet they still have enough yards to build the sufficient ships for what they need to do in World War II. In World War One, there were oodles and yards. Even in the height of spending prior to World War One, when we were in the full race of the Dreadnought race, and there's all construction going around. The Navy's building so many cruisers, so many battleships, all these things. Big major yards which can build battleships are going bankrupt in the UK, and they're closing down. Thames Ironworks. There is a surfeit of infrastructure for the Army, for the Air Force, for the Navy. And that was kept going by having a turnover of equipment, but also by ordering enough that you have the forces to deter conflict, to manage the risk of conflict, and judging the nation's interests. We no longer have that. Also, for much of that period, we had royal dockyards, because they allowed you to maintain infrastructure even in peacetime at an efficient cost to the taxpayer, and make sure that they were going to be viable for what you needed. And that's pretty much what we're doing now, but we're basically keeping a profit margin, providing a profit margin as well. The UK is in a serious situation. I would argue the whole of the vast majority of the world is in a serious situation, whereby its political class, its national leadership, its entire population really, have allowed themselves to believe that they knew the future. And the future was going to be stable. It was going to be a constant upswing from that point onwards, and it was going to be safe. The first things that happened were the economic shocks. We had big economic issues. We also had terrorism, but the first things that showed that it's not just the random black swan events, the things that we don't predict happening. Of course, the joyous thing about black swan events is it a black swan for you or for the event? And if you're in Australia, black swans are the swans. They were only a strange event for Europeans seeing them for the first time. But it's still a good phrase to use, because people tend to get what you're talking about. You're talking about a random event that no one can see coming. The thing is, the first pillar I would argue, was the fact that there wasn't going to be a constant economic upswing. The great market crashes, the great global crash. Then it was health. Oh yes, these big diseases, these spreads of illnesses, they're only things which happen in Asian countries. Then they don't come to Europe, they don't come to America, they're things which happen in Africa and Asia. They don't happen to us. But it happened, and we were woefully unprepared. Unsurprisingly, because we didn't believe it would happen to us. So who's going to put money into preparing for something which will never happen to us? And now we're in a time where we're having to deal with the fact that the security guarantor is looking after their own interests first. And whilst the trouble with being a leader is that you do have to put the group's interests sometimes before your own, That's as long as you're choosing to be the leader. If you choose to not be the leader, you don't have to accept the fact that you're not the leader, but you also don't have to put others' interests first. You don't have to put the group's interests first. And that means that everyone else in the group has to look after their own interests. So we've lost the pillars of economic certainty, of health certainty, and now security certainty. And the thing is, those pillars were never real. Those pillars were hubris. They always were. Nations don't have friendships, they have interests. Alliances work as long as interests align. There is no such thing as economic certainty because the world is mercurial. What matters today might not matter tomorrow. What is the foundation of today's technology could be completely overlooked tomorrow. And what is not or valueless today could be incalculable tomorrow. That is the one constant of humanity, that these things can change. All you can really do as a person, as a group, as a nation, is use the good times, enjoy them, but also use them to prepare so that when the bad times hit, they're not as bad. Sivi pacem para bellum. In times of peace, prepare for war. It's been the Royal Navy's motto for a very, very long time. And it's a very good motto. In times of prosperity, prepare for an idea. In times of health, prepare for illness. In times of peace, prepare for war. Now, to finish with that bit, there are going to be people who say, well, if you prepare for war, you're going to make war more likely. That is always a possibility. But I will say this. Wars tend to be illogical acts. They are started by people who are not thinking rationally and logical, because war is not something you would ever start if you were thinking rational and logical, because it's a beast you cannot control. It's a beast you cannot control. And if someone's already prepared to be that illogical, you have problems. Preparation for war usually actually makes countries feel more confident, feel stronger, feel safer. Which means they're both prepared to talk more at the table as usual, because people who feel confident can sign agreements and give things away if they need to bring about peace. People who feel weak are scared. I'll put another way and to use an example from my own career. Why are academic fights so brutal? Why are they so brutal? Why are the academic debates so brutal? Because the prize is so small. There is so little money to share around that you either fight to the death for every penny, or your career is no more. That's the reality of it. It's the same with security and interests. The countries which feel strongest, are the countries which feel safest. The countries which feel safest can afford to be generous, magnanimous, and creative in their problem solving and solutions. The countries which aren't, they feel scared. And whilst fear is not always the basis for all illogical, irrational decisions, it is the basis for the majority of them in human history. So there you go. An SDSR from a naval historian. Normally I finish my videos with a question, but I hope this will probably start enough discussions without me needing to put in a question. But I will end with a thought for you to ponder. The timeline matters with the introduction of equipment. Cutting something today because it appears old versus a new capability which is coming down the road is not usually the sensible option. Sometimes it's a economically viable option to save you money, but it's not a strategically sensible option. A good example with that is the Harrier decision from 2010. They cut the Harriers, they didn't need carrier strike, and then they were running to recreate it with Apaches operating from HMS Ocean and sending various aircraft flying the whole way over Europe to launch strikes into Libya. But oh no, carrier strike wasn't going to be needed. Also made the cost of regenerating it with the F-35Bs and the Queen Elizabeth class that much more expensive. It also means that we designed a program of aircraft procurement which we slotted into, and based on a phased withdrawal of Harriers as the F-35Bs came into service. The Harriers went early without the upgrades we've been planning to do them. The F-35Bs are still coming in on the same schedule. Is the F-35B a better aircraft than a Harrier? Yes. Is the Tornado a better strike aircraft than a Harrier? Yes. Was it probably the sensible decision to maintain the Tornado fleet over the Harrier fleet? I would argue you're putting into the wrong question even asking that in the first place. They do different things. The Harrier fleet is for your carriers and to make them viable and to give you those options of carrier utility. The Tornado fleet is your strike force. That allows you to reach out and support land operations. Putting them into a scenario where you are setting them up against each other and declaring a winner and a loser and getting rid of one is kind of strategically stupid because they do different things. They're different roles. Yes, it allows you to save money. But ultimately, was Britain well served from a security, capability, and safety perspective by such a decision, by such a competition? That being said, what have we got coming up? Well, tomorrow we have James Somerville, Communications as Leadership, and next week we have the Battle of Northern Shiro, which hopefully I'm going to record both of those on the same day this week. Hopefully. Take care, have fun, and thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed and found it interesting.